Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland, the museum's president, and I am delighted to be here tonight to talk about a fascinating historic character, Marm Mandelbaum, with the equally fascinating, although more innocent of crime as far as I know, Margalit Fox. Yes. So we are going to jump into the 19th century. Before we do, I will formally introduce Margalit Fox. She is the author of many wonderful books, including The Confidence Men, Conan Doyle for the Defense, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, and Talking Hands. She is also, Talking Heads is another, you're not connected to Talking Heads,
Not
are you? Okay, that's it. She is also the author for many years. She wrote the front page send-offs of many important people, an obituary writer for the New York Times. And again, we're so thrilled that she has chosen to talk about this amazing resident of Kleindeutchland, the neighborhood that we're in right now. It's now called the Lower East Side, but this whole neighborhood that we're in was called Kleindeutchland, named for the large number of German immigrants who settled here, making Kleindeutchland the fifth largest German-speaking city in the world at the time. And New York as a whole was the third largest German-speaking city. But, Mrs. Mandelbaum is not someone we learn about in textbooks in American history classes. And I'm wondering how you got to her story. So if you tell us really briefly first who she was and what led you to her story.
Fredericka Mandelbaum was the first great organized crime boss in America. And when we think of organized crime, young people think of Tony Soprano, older people think of the guy in pinstripes and spats with a Tommy gun in Prohibition. Needless to say, Mrs. Mandelbaum, a nice Zoftig Jewish mother of four, was neither. And she ran an extensive, sustained, and lucrative criminal organization with almost complete impunity here in New York for 25 years. And she did this from the late 1850s on, well over half a century before Prohibition, the traditionally accepted starting date for organized crime.
Okay, and let's root this story in Kleindeutchland. For those of you at home, you can see an image of a map of Lower Manhattan, what we again now call the Lower East Side, and it looks like the financial district, the southern part of Manhattan Island. And Kleindeutchland was made up, to my understanding, of the 17th, 10th, 13th, and what's this one above it? 11th.
And if you give the clicker another click, I think it will highlight roughly the rough square mile that was Kleindeutchland. And Mrs. Mandelbaum was from poor Jewish stock in what is now central Germany. She and her husband came to America with their infant daughter in steerage in 1850, settled at a succession of addresses in tenement poverty in Kleindeutchland. Her husband Wolf resumed his work as a peddler, what he had done in the old country, and Fredericka Mandelbaum, young mother, impoverished immigrant, cast about for something that she could do that would contribute meaningfully to the family economy.
And what choices were available to women, a woman immigrant living in Kleindeutschland, in terms of work, paid work?
Well, not only could an immigrant have no chance of making it in polite society, he or she had little chance of making it in legitimate commerce. And an immigrant like Fredericka Mandelbaum was disenfranchised 3 times over: foreigner, woman, and Jew. And so xenophobia, nativism, misogyny, anti-Semitism kept her and many women like her out of the workforce. What many immigrants chose to do, if they couldn't make it in legitimate commerce, because the jobs available to immigrants, men and women, were overwhelmingly demeaning, often dangerous, very low paying, many immigrants, in an effort to provide for their families, sought to climb what sociologists have called the crooked ladder, making their way in the underworld. What is absolutely fascinating, as I learned in my research for the book, is that the gender-based segregation that existed in the upper world, the realm of legitimate commerce, was alive and well in underworld business as well. Men climbing the crooked ladder had any number of choices. They could run numbers rackets, illegal gambling joints, work as hired muscle, helped get out the vote for the Tammany Hall machine. Women had only two choices, shoplifting, and you know what's coming, prostitution. Fredericka Mandelbaum was clearly a proper married woman, smart enough to know that shoplifting was a way to stay in poverty forever, and proper enough to know that prostitution was not going to be on the table for her. So what could she do?
And she worked first as a peddler, correct? What was she, do we know what she was peddling?
We do. We know that she sold lace fabric door to door in streets thronged with peddlers, men, women, little children with push carts, baskets, buckets. We've all seen pictures by Jacob Riis and other 19th century photographers. The streets were crammed. Peddlers were selling everything from shoes, cheap jewelry and fiddle strings to oysters and apple pie. So for any one of these peddlers, the odds against earning enough to keep body and soul together were absolutely overwhelming.
So we are in a saloon that was run by John and Caroline Schneider, also German immigrants, not Jewish, but German immigrants. And they, in some ways they had a step ahead of her in the sense that they came over as teenagers. So by the time they opened their business, they've been somewhat Americanized, but still understand that they can make a living by being here in the heart of Kleindeutchland. And we know this was a place where community came together in many ways. And that community on Sundays could include men and women. But one of the things that struck me a lot in reading about Marm Mandelbaum was that she was remembered often as someone who gave a lot to the community. This idea of community was really bound up in the work that she did. So tell us a little bit about Marm Mandelbaum and this idea of a community.
Well, what's so striking about the Kleindeutchland diaspora is that it seemed to be organized around linguistic background rather than ethnicity and religion per se. And so historical sources made quite clear that you had German-speaking Jews, German-speaking Gentiles, living, working, and even socializing side by side. They all enjoyed themselves in German beer halls on Sunday. They watched German folk parades together. They worked together. And in the criminal organization that Marm Mandelbaum was to build, her employees ran the gamut. There were German Jews like her, there were German Gentiles, and there were people from other immigrant backgrounds, and even some native-born. So, as one of my friends said, she was the original DEI employer.
So how did she get from peddling to crime, and what was the kind of crime that she was involved in?
Marm Mandelbaum was what is called a fence. She was a receiver of stolen goods. One of the things that I felt gave me permission to tell her story and really, if not celebrate her, at least indicate that in some quarters she was venerated as kind of a charming rogue, a Robin Hood figure, was that her brand of organized crime, unlike that of the guys in pinstripes who came later, was almost entirely non-violent. She was interested in what she might have called the careful redistribution of personal property. She robbed really good stuff from the rich, or rather her minions did, and sold, or rather, sold indeed at deep discount to the country's newly emerging middle class. So she was a fence, and she built an entire organization around stolen luxury goods and later diversified into bank robbery.
So let's talk a little bit about those goods, because it just kind of one of the things I love about this book, there are so many things, but there's so much rich detail, and you get the sense of the material world that she was living in and those around her. And so, I guess let's follow this in two tracks. One is, what were the kind of the neighborhood, the buildings that she lived in? What was that building like on the corner of Clinton and Rivington? Let's start with that kind of her headquarters, in other words. And I think we have an image of that, so let's go to that too. 1 second, I'll find it. But you can start talking about
her headquarters. It may be prior to that.
Okay.
Her headquarters were a modest haberdashery shop at the corner of Clinton and Rivington Streets, only a few blocks from here. And anyone could go in off the street and buy a length of lace, a yard of fabric, a spool of thread, although they must surely have marveled at the very deep below wholesale discounts. Well, there was a reason for that. Behind that haberdashery shop was the headquarters of her real business, a walled-off warren of secret back rooms with secret entrances and exits where fine swag was brought to her for effacement of any identifying marks that might have allowed the owner to be traced, and for surreptitious resale. Now, one of the fascinating things is you can really see what sort of Mr. and Mrs. America in this newly emerging middle class were under great social pressure to buy, fueled by advertisements in newspapers, magazines, manuals of domestic advice. So Mrs. Mandelbaum, had her increasingly skilled, increasingly high-end coterie of thieves, men and women, steal bolts of silk, other fine fabrics, jewelry, silver, even furniture. At the time, thanks to industrialization, urbanization, the growth of professional work, this new middle class had emerged. And at the same time, thanks to mass production, America was flooded by a tsunami of stuff that the middle class was very quickly being taught to crave. The other thing they learned quickly is that when you want to load up your home with all of this stuff but don't want to pay full price, what do? You pay a covert nighttime visit to your friendly neighborhood fence.
So I don't know if the audience has been able to see that, but we now have the image of her home. So you see the kind of how, even though like the goods that she has are like the most luxuriant silks and the most wonderful jewels, they were secreted behind this very like humble looking edifice. So it blended in, and she had her own shop in front of it, right? So there was the dry goods shop and her haberdashery shop that she ran, but then behind the walls, and even one of my favorite details was that didn't her fireplace have a dumbwaiter behind it?
Right. When you're in the line of work that Mrs. Mandelbaum is in, you are susceptible to raids by the police when they occasionally come under public pressure to make an arrest. So she had in her walled-off back rooms where the real business was transacted a secret dumbwaiter built into the chimney of a fireplace back there, and if peering through the bars she saw the cops come in to the front of the shop, she would just pull a lever, stash whatever jewels or silk or silver she had on hand that of course didn't actually belong to her, and hoist it up to another floor out of sight. Now the upper floors of this building, because she eventually became wealthy enough to buy the whole building, the upper floors contained her private apartments where she raised her 4 children. And they are, as I say, like a New World Palace of Versailles. I hope you're seeing now the image of this grand dinner party. We have Marm at the far right with the fan. She's circled. And this is not some random generic dinner party drawing. This is a 19th century engraving of one of her parties. She gave parties as luxuriant and opulent as anything Mrs. Astor might give uptown. Down one side of the table, in full evening dress, would be master thieves who worked for her, and wining and dining with them down the other side of the table, also in evening dress, would be a pack of Tammany Hall judges and aldermen and local pals, plus some very high officials of the New York Police Department. And they were all merrily doing business together.
So this is a community she cultivated in some ways that helped protect her business. But the other thing that allows her to kind of operate for so many years, although this would change, but no one was really going after the fences, right? So they were in some ways protected from a lot of investigation.
Fencing in those years, providentially for Marm and operators like her, had a rather indistinct status. There was little basis for prosecution apart from the original crime itself. In those years, in order to prosecute offense, the DA would have to prove not only that he or she knew they were not only that he or she was receiving stolen goods, but he had to prove guilty knowledge. He had to prove that he or she knew those goods to be stolen. And since the party to the transaction are normally only the thief and the fence, that's very hard to prove. And Mrs. Mandelbaum very quickly became an incredibly wealthy woman, beautifully dressed in silk, dripping with diamonds, gave generously to her synagogue, Rodolph Sholem, which is still going on the Upper West Side. It used to be down here. Created jobs for her neighbors, helped neighbors with her rent, and let us just say that she took the injunction, the policeman is your friend, to very businesslike and even lucrative extremes. So she was a very hard woman to prosecute.
And again, these were, she, let's assume she was motivated by a genuine sense and love and of community, but this was something that helps her up until a certain point. But this, I'm just quoting from your book, a source that describes how her neighbors kind of watched over for her. So this was later on a Pinkerton detective who was shadowing her, said it was like difficult work. All Mrs. Mandelbaum's neighbors knew what her business was, and when they saw anybody watching, they ran and told her. Down the window shades would come, and they remained down for days. After 6 weeks spying, the family dropped on us, meaning that the family realized that they were being watched. And I love this part too. They must have noticed that whenever anybody left the store with a bundle, we followed to see where he went. One day, Stout, who would be her second, not her husband, but her friend, sallied forth with his arms filled with packages. He got on a horse car, and our men, the Pinkerton detectives, sat behind him. He turned around and presented them each with a bundle. Take them now, he said. It will save you the trouble of following me. They were bundles of paper. So, I mean, just kind of amazing to think about the way in which the neighbors really were, they understood that they benefited from her continued business.
Absolutely. And she was very good to her neighbors. I think some of it was sort of authentic tenderheartedness, but a lot of it was naked self-interest. For instance, she did eventually become wealthy enough to buy her entire building, and then she had the opulent apartment. She had all of these rooms where stolen goods could be stored and reworked to elude identification. But before she was rich enough to do that, she would pay the rent on apartments for local families throughout Kleindeutchland in exchange for the use of a room to store all of the silk and the kid gloves and the cashmere shawls and the jewelry and the silverware that her minions were starting to bring to her. So everybody benefits.
Is it possible that one of the tenements here could have been a space where some of these goods might have spent some time?
It is certainly within the realm of possibility. We can't say what we don't know, but I don't see why not.
Well, to that point of how we know what we know, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about the sources that have allowed you to, as you put, use a kind of bricolage to put not just this character together, but the whole system that she masterminded. So tell me a little bit about your sources.
Well, normally when you write historical biography, your first port of call is always the archive of personal papers that your subject has thoughtfully left behind, neatly cataloged for posterity. Well, guess what? In Mrs. Mandelbaum's case, there were none. She wasn't stupid. I feel safe to impute to her the clear knowledge that in her line of work, committing anything to paper would have been professional suicide. She was clearly aware of that. So that made my job harder. She was always around, kind of glimmering below the surface of many, many books on New York City history. I lay no claim to having discovered her. She was always there for the taking. In Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, she makes 3 or 4 little cameo appearances, and you think, wait a minute, a nice Jewish mother, lady crime boss? What's up with that? And the only way to find out is to sift the historical records in a way that felt like panning for gold. And so I went through hundreds upon hundreds of 19th century newspaper articles, some of them on microfilm, so black with decay it looked as though whole pages were redacted. I think we have an unhappy picture of that very situation. It's maybe there we go. So that's part of what I was up against. Through the great cooperation of the municipal archives of the city of New York, we found some wonderful historical court records, including, fitting for this age when everyone in our time is getting indicted, her indictment. And we have it here. There it is. And if you tap again, you can see her name circled. They spelled her name wrong. They left out the K. This is when the Pinkertons, at the DA's bidding, finally did close in on her in 1884. But before that, from the late 50s, when she started her rise as a receiver of stolen goods, she worked for 25 years without spending so much as a day in jail.
So let's think about all the people that she was connected with. So again, if she's like an organized crime, who is she organizing, and what does that involve? So we can start maybe first with thinking about the people that are involved in, the theft of silk or jewels. So let's start with that.
Well, she had men and women working for her. She's like anyone rising in business. You don't walk into a corporation with the ink barely dry on your MBA and be made the CEO, and likewise you don't climb the crooked ladder and immediately start out as a crime boss. So, like any businesswoman, she started small and built up. Clearly she knew that peddling lace in the street was going to keep her and her family in poverty forever. By the end of the 1850s, she'd been here less than a decade, she became an apprentice to two older Jewish men, General Abe Greenthal and Mose Erich, who were considered master fences. She became their apprentice and disciple.
And I'm assuming the general is he wasn't in the military, it was just something that
no. I think Abe Greenthal was a general like Colonel Sanders is a colonel. And so she learned under their careful tutelage the value of these luxury goods that Americans were increasingly being taught to crave, but tellingly didn't want to pay full price for. Cashmere, kid gloves, silk, sealskin, lace, jewelry, silver, eventually diamonds. And so she starts out small, reselling things that she gets from neighborhood pickpockets and petty thieves, asking no questions, selling it on, building capital. As a historian I spoke to said wonderfully, she clearly realized very early that it would be the accrual of capital rather than wage work that would be her only ticket out of poverty. And that's what she did. And so then she accrues enough capital, she goes out on her own as a solo entrepreneur. She's now a full-time fence, and she recruits better and better employees. There are, in the mid-19th century, these marvelous palaces of merchandise that would soon be called department stores, mercantile pleasure palaces that were already swarming with female pickpockets. That was women's work in the criminal world. She recruited them, the good ones, into her employ because she could give them steady work, the promise of bail if they were arrested, and she mothered her thieves. This is why she was called Mother or Ma or Marm Mandelbaum. She wined and dined them at the groaning table that we saw. She gave them bail if they were arrested, and my favorite thing, looking from a 21st century perspective, she provided getaway horses and carriages when they needed to flee slowly the scene of a crime. And thieves adored her, many of them. She was considered motherly. She had 4 children who lived to at least young adulthood. They adored her. She adored them. So her cadre of thieves got bigger and better. So the shoplifters come, then men whom she enjoins to hoist big, heavy bolts of expensive silk fabric from the docks of New York, from warehouses. One of the historians, a journalist actually who interviewed me, said something very interesting that he hadn't realized till he read the book, that silk attained the status of a kind of underground currency. And the reason is fascinating. It's a fascinating window onto American material culture at that time. There was, until the very end of the 19th century, no ready-to-wear for American woman. A man could walk into a shop and buy a suit off the rack starting in the mid-1800s. A woman couldn't buy a shirt or skirt or shirtwaist off the rack until the 1890s, and this blew my mind. She couldn't buy a dress off the rack until after World War I. So what did that mean? It meant that all women until the end of the 19th century, rich women, poor women, either made their own clothes or had them made by a dressmaker. And so silk, fine fabrics in general, silk in particular, at discount, below wholesale prices, was in perennial demand. And Mrs. Mandelbaum was smart enough to see that as a gap in the market that she and her cadre of thieves could rush in to fill.
And then the silk, though, I mean, one of the things, the other people she had to have in her employ, though, if they stole jewels that were engraved or set in particular ways, or silk that had been marked. From your book, I learned that the silk was always marked with a particular initials or some indication of the house that it belonged to. So she would then have to hire other people to kind of remove, jewelers to take away the inscriptions, the engravings, and so on.
The warren of secret back rooms behind her haberdashery shop basically housed the structure of a mail-order fulfillment house. She had swag coming in and rooms to store it, places to hang up the fur coats, and the places to store the bolts of silk and so on. In one room, she had a team of hand-picked German artisans working to efface any identifying marks from silver. Let's say they bring a beautiful silver watch or a gold watch. Well, more likely as not, it's going to have the owner's name engraved on the back, or a testimonial inscription, something that makes it traceable back to the owner. Well, if you're in her line of work, that won't do. So she had these artisans, these engravers, masterfully engrave a little picture over the author's name, thereby completely obscuring it, and only then was it safe for her to sell the watch on.
And is she the only one in New York doing this, or is she the only one who does it with so many layers of? And is it the scale that she's doing it, or is she the only woman, or what is that?
She was certainly far from the only receiver of stolen goods. New York was by then the undisputed economic capital of America, and talking about silk, something like 80% of the nation's textile imports were coming through New York by the mid to late 19th century. So there were plenty of slices of that pie to go around. There were certainly other fences, but very few women that I have ever encountered, few to none, it's safe to say, in such a position of power, who had so many people working for her, such an extensive empire. She had thieves and resale agents all over the country, and it was said even into Mexico and perhaps even in Europe. And she did this unimpeded for 25 years, so I don't know of anyone, and certainly no woman, who did it so successfully with so much remuneration and for so long.
And so then, this is enough of an accomplishment, but her next accomplishment is looking at bank burglaries and the planning of the bank burglaries, involving, again, another cast of characters and another set of skills. So tell us a little bit about the bank burglaries.
That's right. And here again, as with the silk, it's an extraordinary window onto American material culture. We all think, I certainly thought from the movies and TV, that bank robbery, bank burglaries, as these nighttime operations are properly called, we think that they were always a going concern in America. Not so. As I learned, until the 1860s, bank burglaries were relatively rare. The reason was that the country was on the gold standard. In colonial times, each of the 13 colonies issued paper money at some point. It was very crude and therefore easy prey for counterfeiters. So along comes American independence. The framers of the Constitution are well aware of this problem, so they empower Congress to coin money, but not to print it. And so imagine the difficulty if you want to separate a bank from its contents. Those contents are bars of gold. You have to then lug your booty loudly and heavily down the street, and then there's your poor horse and getaway carriage to consider. That's going to slow things down. And so even the new breed of organized criminals until the 1860s gave banks a wide berth. Then what happens? 1861, Civil War. The Union desperately needs to raise money quickly to wage it, and so President Lincoln authorizes the creation and disbursement of greenbacks. Soon the nation is flooded with paper money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is 19th century dollars. In the underworld, there is much rejoicing because suddenly you have swag, you have an object of desire that is lightweight, whisper, quiet, and eminently portable. And that's when bank burglary became a viable full-time occupation. And so Fredericka Mandelbaum knew she was brilliant at having her finger to the economic winds and seeing what the trends were. She knew this was an act she wanted to get in on, and she did.
And you describe this in such a detail. I feel like I was at, the scene of the crime in the 1860s. Do you feel what about if I told you that we have a time machine for you? We're going to send you back to the mid-19th century. Do you think you now would be able to pull off one of these heists?
Strikingly, it wasn't woman's work. Fredericka clearly helped mastermind bank robberies. She helped work out logistics. And like an angel investing in a Broadway show, she invested money because depending on the situation, what the ceiling was made out of that they might have to cut through to get to the vault, the rooms that they would have to rent for months to surveil the neighborhood, the bribes that they would have to pay to watchmen and cops on the beat. It requires a lot of capital going in to underwrite a bank robbery. And believe me, she made it back on the other end. She was said to get as much as 50% of the proceeds. And many of these, again, got hundreds of thousands of dollars in 19th century money.
And one aspect of this, just to kind of show the amount of planning and the investment that it took, you write about how one of the men she worked with, George Leonidas
Leslie, yeah.
George Leonidas Leslie, she gave him her warehouse. She also had these warehouses in Brooklyn, all over, where some of her goods were stored.
Right.
I guess after she moved on from the tenements and stole goods and stored goods there, she literally gave him the space and funded recreations of the bank buildings and the bank rooms that they were going to rob, and they would set it up as if they were setting up a play and practice this work.
That's exactly right. George Leslie was her favorite employee, king of the bank robbers. He was from a cultured middle-class background and somehow went wrong or went right by Mrs. Mandelbaum's point of view. And he would indeed, had a master architectural eye, and he would go into the banks that were going to be his quarry, go in as a putative customer, and basically memorize the positions of all of the furniture, all of the offices, where the vault was, where the teller's windows were. There's a couch here, a table there, and then indeed he would recreate that as a stage set in one of Marm's Brooklyn warehouses, and he would have his hand-picked crew of nocturnal bank burglar types go through everything they were going to do on the day of the robbery in darkness to make sure they didn't so much as bump a table when the day came.
And then the other challenge they had is the locks and learning what to do with the locks, and that there were special One detail that I love was you would put a string in a lock and then see from that string the number that had been hit and be able to kind of put things back together in that way.
That's right. There was a wire tool called the Little Joker that Leslie himself may have used. It's the authorship of its invention is in dispute, but you would actually have to break into a bank 3 times. So in a way it was risky, in a way it was really good practice. You would first install this little loop of wire invisibly behind the dial, and when a bank employee next worked the safe dial, the points at which the tumbler stopped would be scribed onto the wire. Then, of course, you had to break into the bank again to take the wire out, see where the scribe marks were, and the positions of the numbers on the dial that they corresponded to. And then, of course, if you were lucky, you would break in a 3rd time using that hard-won knowledge and rob the bank blind.
That's amazing. And the theater, theater also, again, there was this theater and staging everything, but Marm Mandelbaum was so well known that she literally becomes a character in plays.
That's right. And this is the thing that's striking, and of course it happens all too often with women's history, as we know, although Fredericka Mandelbaum is a largely forgotten name today. In her own day, she was literally world famous. To jump ahead for a moment, when she died in 1894, her death was covered in newspapers as far away as London. And so if you just put the name Marm Mandelbaum in a paper, most people would know who it was. And she was indeed the model for characters in 2 different stage plays. One appeared in 1895, the year after she died, but the one that I hope is on your screen now, it's a French play called Les Deux Orphelines, premiered in 1874, and here that same year, in English translation, not far from here, the Union Square Theater. And we absolutely know from newspaper accounts that Mrs. Mandelbaum, dressed in her finery, she was an enormous woman, dressed in these vast gowns of rustling silk, dripping diamonds head to toe, went to the Union Square Theater and sat in a private box to see this play that had a character circled here named Mother Frochard, who was the head of a murderous Parisian crime family of grifters. And Fredericka saw the play and was incensed, not at the fact that she was being portrayed on stage as a criminal, that was fine, but incensed at how frumpily her character was costumed. She's basically in this crappy house dress. She was so angry that she summoned the manager of the theater and gave him a good tongue lashing. That was what a tough old bird she was.
Also the fact that she dressed so opulently also showed how secure she felt. She wasn't walking around worried about getting arrested or drawing attention to herself. She did not mind the attention, which again I think shows how comfortable she was in this environment.
That's right. And remember, this is someone who came here in steerage, not by steam, but by sailing ship. 6 weeks, 8 weeks below deck, filthy, crowded, unsanitary conditions, in the tenement poverty in which she and her husband lived in their first years. Their infant daughter, who had made the crossing with them, died, clearly of one of the diseases that were sweeping through the tenements like brush fires. And so it is absolutely verboten to impute thought or impute intent to someone who has left no journal, no personal papers, but it is clearly safe to say from the entire career that followed that A, she was not going to live in poverty nor have her family live in poverty ever again, and B, that she was clearly extremely proud of how far she had lifted herself up. Never mind how she got there, she got there.
And she, again, as you said earlier, she did this for about a quarter of a century. She was able to kind of live this life, do her thing, amass this wealth, acquire this property, dress as she did, raise her children, be a benefactress to the community. But it changes.
It does change, and it changes because America changed. She had 25 free and easy years from about 1859, when she started fencing, to her downfall in 1884. And what had happened in the country and in New York, exquisitely, is that the control of American cities was passing from the hands of these scrappy, up by your bootstrap immigrants, the people who ran the Tammany Hall machine so profitably. Control was passing to native-born, high-wasp, Ivy League educated patrician men. And in that milieu, a brazen immigrant Jewish woman who unabashedly did not know her place no longer had any place. And what's so telling is the objection of these new bourgeois elites to Fredericka and people like her wasn't moralistic, it was economic, because these guys were capitalists, and it was beyond dispute that by the 1880s, Mrs. Mandelbaum in particular was seriously cutting into profits in three industries: textiles, jewelry, and banking. And so she had to be stopped.
And she goes on trial. Adding to the theater of all of this are her lawyers that she's had for decades, Howe and Hummel, who are notorious for their techniques. But also, again, in reading these scenes of the court and all the machinations they employed to avoid the court date, but they were not able to do so, they had their own theater, their own costumes, their own way of doing things. So tell us a little bit about Howe and Hummel.
Fredericka kept the downtown law firm of William Howe and Abraham Hummel on allegedly $5,000 a year retainer. That's something like $100,000 in today's money. Howe and Hummel were straight out of Damon Runyon, if he had lived that far back. They represented pretty much the entire New York underworld and would stop at nothing to get their client's acquittal. And they usually won acquittal through means that included, but were not limited to, bribery, suborning perjury, possibly fixing judges, possibly fixing juries, and just costumed theatrical courtroom spectaculars. Howe was as fond of jewelry as Fredericka Mandelbaum and had as much personal expense for its display as she did. And their courtroom dramas were literally supposed to be such good theater that the Bowery Playhouse downtown was said to do stage readings of Howe and Hummel trial transcripts.
And that also reminds me when they were planning some of the bank burglaries, didn't they go to theater houses and opera houses and borrow costumes for the bank burglars?
In one case that we know of, one of Mrs. M's favorite burglars, he was having an affair with an actress, and so he would hang out at one of the New York theaters. And so, of course, he went by the costume shop, the wig shop, and he thought, these will work very nicely for a bank burglary we're planning up in Maine. And so, indeed, there was a bank burglary enacted by Mrs. M's crew in Dexter, Maine, where the burglars wore wigs and false mustaches courtesy of the New York Opera House.
And bald, also, they have like the bald, things to make them look bald in some cases too. That was the one. But more importantly, or more of it as a side note, one of the things too that struck me is that the burglar who she had an affinity for was having an affair with this actress. But that was problematic because he could get into trouble with that. So she wants him to fall in love with someone else. He goes to Philadelphia. He does fall in love with someone else. Mm-hmm. So that's great. She's happy. But the problem is she has another suitor who's a criminal. So Marm, being the caring woman that she is, sets this guy up to commit a crime whereby he would get caught, thereby freeing up this young woman for her favorite burglar to marry. I mean, so again, another example of how she masterminded love and community were part of business. is it giving anything away to ask you how the trial ends?
Well, so in 1884, the district attorney, Peter Olney, newly sworn in district attorney, and he is one of these new high wasp Protestant elite, Harvard-educated, old patrician New England family. And so he's one of them. He's one of these new capitalists. He vows to go after Fredericka. Well, if you're the district attorney, how do you do that? I guess I should say in the criminal justice system, the people are represented in this case by the district attorneys who prosecute crime, but not by the police, because he knows the police are all on her payroll. So what does he do? He enlists an outside agency, the Pinkertons, who are, in the words of one historian, capital's muscle. They are famous by this point, this is the 1880s, for being hired by some of America's foremost robber barons to break strikes, often with fatalities. And, you know, it's only a striking worker, they're expendable. They are not good guys, despite how they are portrayed in the 17 memoirs written by their founder, Alan Pinkerton. And so the DA, Peter Olney, enlists the Pinkertons to go after Marm Mandelbaum, and they do it through good old-fashioned entrapment. In 1884, she's entrapped, arrested, for the first time that we are aware of, indicted, and scheduled to stand trial. December 1884, the trial date comes. The clock strikes 11. The bailiff steps forward and calls the defendant to the stand. Fredericka Mandelbaum, he cries, and there's no answer. Her employer and lover, Hermann Staude, who is indicted along with her, Hermann Staude, no answer. Her 20-year-old son, Julius Mandelbaum, indicted with her, no answer. Where are they? They're gone. So she never stood trial and spent the last 10 rather difficult years of her life as a fugitive from the law.
And she never, and apparently, because she's interviewed many times after that too, and she talked about how much she would love to be back in Kleindeutchland, how much she missed the air and the community of Kleindeutchland. So in some ways she was punished, I guess, in that regard.
That's right. She considered living away from there kind of a living death. She was clearly in torment, although very soon up to her old tricks, and an American journalist goes to where she's hiding out, and she says, I'm running a store here because I love to run a store. I have these beautiful watches. They're a little bit used, but no less lovely for that. Can I sell you anything? She says to the journalist.
She's doing what she does best for to the end of her life. One other thing that you'll learn when we've only scratched the surface of her fascinating life. This book you can order from our shop, and when you order it from our shop, you can do this online, you will get a signed copy from Margalit Fox for this book. The other thing, again, I hope I don't, you want to get this book if only to find out what Mrs. Mandelbaum does to the Pinkerton detective who had pretended, who had entrapped her when they meet up. So that's something that can, among other things, can induce you to buy this book and read so much more about her. Do we have any questions? Yes, Leah. We're gonna. And if you're watching online, feel free to write questions in the chat, and we'll be able to ask those as well. We're going to turn now to our live audience, and Leo is going to ask a question.
Hi. Thank you so much. One is a thought and one is a question. So in The American Gangster, in the movie, which is, has some similar themes, the police is chasing the two protagonists, one the cop and one the kind of criminal lord. And his demise comes from the fact that he buys a mink coat, I think, or something like this, and they just basically unable to get him on any crimes that they can, get him on tax evasion or something like that.
Well, that's like Spiro Agnew.
Sort of, yeah. And I don't think that one is... Has anyone seen it? But I was just wondering, how safe did she feel, even knowing that she has police in her corner? Because the character played by Denzel Washington in this movie also thinks he has police in his corner, but for such blatant demonstrations of unaffordable lifestyle eventually were too dangerous. So was she ever like in the risk of that? And the second is simpler. There was a legend of her coming back to New York one more time in disguise sometime later on. Is it made up?
No.
No.
To answer your second question first, and I'll get to that, it's a very moving story. The first question, it wasn't her opulent lifestyle that brought her down. She would not have, her opulent lifestyle, if anything, kept her safe because it allowed her to rub elbows with, some of the most powerful people in the upper world and connect. In order for underworld business to survive and thrive, those connections need to be maintained constantly. There are basically three ways in which a criminal receiver can keep herself safe. One is through outright graft and bribery, which we know she did. Another is through accommodating people with goods. And again, policemen's wives, like other women, made their own clothes. They would have needed the below wholesale silk in her haberdashery shop. And the third way is crucial. That is, during those rare times when the police are under public pressure to make a showy arrest, the fence can throw them sacrificial fish who are members, dispensable members of their own organization. And without giving too much away, Mrs. Mandelbaum did that one time too many, and the person she sacrificed, who wound up going to jail for 5 years, when this person got out, it was payback time. Now, indeed, Mrs. Mandelbaum lived as a fugitive out of the country for the last 10 years, but during that time, her beautiful youngest child, her daughter Annie, who was 18, was in New York, developed a cold. The cold turns to pneumonia. This is way before antibiotics. Annie dies. Whatever the risk, Fredericka was determined to bid her beloved youngest child goodbye one last time. And so, possibly in disguise, she travels covertly to New York. And this is the thing I find very moving. I'm often asked, you write that she was a generous member of her synagogue, but do you think she really was devout, or was she doing this just for display and self-protection? I think she really was devout, because when Annie died, again, the family is so famous that Annie's death made the New York papers, and so it was well known that the police would be watching Jewish burial grounds around the city in the hope of arresting Fredericka, because there's a warrant out for her arrest, when she came to the funeral. So some smart person in Fredericka's entourage says, hey, look, let's give the kid a Christian burial instead. The cops won't be looking there. It'll be safer for you. And Fredericka wouldn't hear of it. She insisted that her child be buried in accordance with their faith, whatever the risk. And indeed she was.
Great. Well, we've got some wonderful friends tuning in from all over the country, as well as, I think, our farthest friends coming from Colombia, Canada, and Taipei, Taiwan. So welcome everyone who's joining us virtually. Some additional questions to what was just asked. Could you share specifically, Margalit, where she was hiding, and did her family go with her?
Well, I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you. She was hiding out of the country, we'll say that. She was living in exile the last 10 years. She did bring 3 of her 4 children to live with her, including the young daughter Annie, but because Annie was not under indictment, she could cross back into the United States at will, and she had gone, when she died, she was in New York on a visit to some friends.
Great, thank you, Judy, for that question. Angela had a question. Oops, sorry, that was Angela's question. Judy's question is, what became of her husband, and did he work with her?
That's like the other thing. I mean, he is such a silent character in the book.
There is a man with the wonderful name of George Washington Walling, who was the chief of police in New York during Marm's heyday, and he writes a lot about her. And writing about the Mandelbaums as a couple, Walling says, and this is so great it's burned into my brain, says, the woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. She was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity, a nebbish, as we would say. And it's pretty clear that the kind of don't ask, don't tell strategy that you have with your thieves when you are a reseller of stolen goods extended to her marriage. And he remained a peddler, Wolf Mandelbaum, clearly not involved in her business, and then in 1875 he died, probably of consumption. So in any case, she was then the sole support of her household. She had 4 children by then.
And I'm going to imagine he dressed more modestly than she.
I would imagine. We don't know much about him, and I think that's the way he wanted it.
A couple questions from David. Do you have any recommendations for sources to find out more about her family from a genealogical perspective? Does your book include a list of sources for the records consultant?
And the records not to consult, right? She not only tells about the sources, she tells you what sources are not legitimate.
Right. There is, sadly, all of the best anecdotes about Mrs. Mandelbaum had to be thrown out because they come from 2 completely spurious sources. And I alert readers to those in an author's note that precedes the 50-some page bibliography of legitimate sources. So, yes, there are many sources. As for genealogy, I was able to trace her family clearly down 2 generations to the level of her grandchildren, and we know this because her granddaughter in the 1920s had a couple of arrests for really petty stuff. One was writing a bad check, one was stealing a fur muff from another woman, but once the newspapers got hold of it and established, she had a different last name, but once the newspapers made the connection to the notorious grandmother, they had a field day with it. Family after that, I've had a few readers write to me saying, I think I'm related to her. So it's really a question of how one works the genealogy. It was not in my remit to work it down that far.
It sounds as if the granddaughter didn't quite inherit the grandmother's skills.
No, I suspect Fredericka would have held those piddling crimes in contempt. So, yes.
And David also asked, where was Annie buried? Do you know?
Wolf, Annie, and eventually Fredericka, who in death was repatriated, are buried in Queens in Rodolphe Chalom's cemetery, and the exact name of the cemetery is in the book.
Union Field?
Yeah, Union Fields, I believe.
And, you know, again, one of the things I was interested in was this connection to Rodolphe Chalom, and it looks as if in 1892, Rodolphe Chalom, which, as you said, was started in Kleindeutchland, although it's now in the Upper West Side, and they were very conscious of the importance of their history, and in 1892 or so did a 50-year anniversary book, and they made mention of Marm Mandelbaum. So they seem to be proud of the connection as well.
That's extremely interesting. Well, she was still alive, but safely out of the country in 1892. She died in 1894.
The other source I want to also call that I know you attribute a lot to is Rona Holub's dissertation, who had done so much research on Marm Mandelbaum as well. Any other questions?
Maybe just one. I mean, you talked of her relationship a bit with the media of the day, journalists. I mean, we think of the relationship of famous and infamous people today with the media. Was there anything more of ways that she used the media to her advantage at the time period, or is it simply just the public's fascination with her as this figure, and why her renown would spread as far as it did?
No, I think, again, it's safe. It's a guess, but it's an educated guess. It's reasonably safe to assume that when you were in her line of work in that day, you did your best to stay out of the media. And indeed, when one of her favorite thieves had an affair with a celebrated actress, one of the reasons she hustled him out of town and through various machinations got him married off to someone else, she didn't want it in the papers because the affair would inevitably lead to his role in her organization. So you did your best to stay out of the papers, but at the same time, everyone knew who she was, and she was pretty openly covered in the press, and papers would at least allude to her illicit activities, and some of them would say outright, the other day, Mother Mandelbaum, the notorious East Side Fence, was seen doing thus and so. So it was kind of a push-pull thing with the media.
Thank you.
And again, the book, just to praise it again, but not only do you use the sources to bring her to life, through the process you're really bringing out so many of the business and cultural and social elements of New York City at the time and how it's changing in a critical era. So I urge you to get the book. If you're getting the book, I urge you also to do it from our shop. It supports us as a nonprofit. You can get the book, and it'll be signed with a nameplate, a special tenement nameplate. I want to thank the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York, the National Park Service, Con Edison, Humanities New York, and the New York State Council of Affairs for helping support us. Also, you and your membership help support us as well, so I urge you to become a member if you aren't. And thank you, and hello to all the members out there. Also, hi, Mom. I know that you're watching because I know you're fascinated by crime, although I know you yourself are innocent of all wrongdoings. Thank you all for tuning in. Please join us on Monday night when we're going to be joined by two other historians. We're going to have some beer because it's 3 historians in a saloon, and we're going to talk about voting rights and immigration rights and how those have kind of come together over time. And so I'll be joined by Jelani Cobb, Dean of Columbia Journalism, and also May Nye, one of our trustees and a wonderful historian of American history. So please join us on Monday. Please become a member. Please come visit us, where you can hear the stories of tenement dwellers that might have stored Marm Mandelbaum's goods from time to time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful book.
Oh, my pleasure.
That's it.